Is it time to panic on Josh Jacobs, or should I be buying low? That is one of the questions we are going to be answering today. My name is Cameron Lawrence, and welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellows YouTube channel. We are here with your week 2 buy lows and sell highs, and guys, let me tell you, we got some juicy ones today. Last week, I hope you bought on T. Higgins, just like I said, and I hope you got rid of Cam Akers, just like we had discussed, just like moldy bread. We don't want him on our team anymore. Before we jump into it, make sure you turn on your notifications, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chance to get better. But let's jump right in with our first buy low, Jamar Chase. We talked about his teammate, like I mentioned earlier, T. Higgins last week. But this may be the only time you are ever able to buy Jamar Chase low. And you know what? A lot of it has to do with Burrow potentially missing week 3, the way he's been banged up. Jamar Chase has put up back-to-back single-digit weeks. A lot of people are telling you that they are scared about Jamar Chase. And yes, I understand Joe Burrow has not looked right. I understand that Joe Burrow has looked hurt. But Joe Burrow is going to figure it out. This team is going to figure it out. Both Burrow and Chase are too good, are too elite, have proven it time and time again that they are good enough to figure it out for us to be this worried that we're not going to try and buy low on Jamar Chase at this point. And no, I'm not talking about you giving up Tyler Lockett or Kendrick Bourne for Jamar Chase. Nobody wants that garbage. Nobody wants to see that in their trade inbox. But guys like Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Mike Evans even, if you're in a more inexperienced league, I would trade those guys plus to get Chase. And honestly, that probably won't be enough to just trade him straight up, but I would add on to that because we are talking about a guy in Jamar Chase who was on a 17-game pace to lead the NFL in targets and be second in receiving touchdowns last season. A guy who was the wide receiver 12 in only 12 games. So all I want to say is that he is not a guy to panic on because of how elite he is, how elite he can be if you do have him. So if he is on your roster, do not get rid of him. But he is a buy low, and this might be one of the few times that you'll ever be able to buy low on Jamar Chase without selling your entire team. You have a chance to get him for maybe a Calvin Ridley, or one of those guys who has been riding high on the wave that I mentioned earlier, Deebo, Brandon Ayuk, or Mike Evans. But I would go and try to acquire Jamar Chase. A player that I'm looking to sell high on is DeAndre Swift. But Cameron, did you see last week? Did you see how unstoppable he was? That he was the clear lead back in Detroit with 28 touches, or Philadelphia rather. He finally got the volume we always wanted him to get in Detroit. And yeah, I did see that. Did you also see that Boston Scott averaged 8 yards per carry, and the only reason he left the game is because of concussion? I also saw what will probably be one of the worst defensive lines in all of football. And seeing that Jalen Hurts has probably been the shakiest that we've seen him in the last 20 games we've seen him in. I also know that last season, Miles Sanders had 1,200 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns, and on over 5 yards a carry, and they had no interest in re-signing him. And one of the big reasons for that, one of the reasons they didn't want to re-sign Miles Sanders is because this Eagles team thinks that anybody can run behind this line. So do I think that Swift is an extremely talented running back? Yes, that is not what I want you to hear. I've liked Swift ever since he came out. I think he's a great talent. But I don't think that wipes away the fact that in week 1, Kenny Gainwell had 18 of the 23 running back touches. That Swift was non-existent. So what I do think will happen in this backfield is exactly what Nick Sirianni told us. Some weeks it will be Swift weeks, and some weeks it won't. And we're not necessarily going to be privileged to the information on which one is which. So your job is to find somebody in your league who believes that every single week Swift is the workhorse back. Because if somebody believes that, they believe that this is a guy with top 12 upside. So again, will Swift have great weeks? Yes, we talked about that last week with Tyler Algier, Michael Pittman. These guys can have great weeks, but it's just not going to be consistent. So guys I'm looking to trade Swift for: Joe Mixon. Ugh. Ramondre Stevenson, gross so far. Rachaad White, even James Conner. These are gross names, but they are players who are going to be way more consistent, who are already running back ones on their team in solidified roles. That's what I'm looking for. Guys with similar ceiling to Swift, but who are going to have more stability throughout the year. My next buy low is another running back. I'm going with Josh Jacobs. Cameron, how can you ask me? Tell me with a straight face to go trade for a guy who just put up -2 yards in a game. And I agree that it was ugly. And Josh Jacobs has not looked like himself. He has struggled this year so far. And I think a big part of that was the fact that he had no training camp, no preseason because of his contract situation. Obviously, he brought it onto himself. And if you have him on your team, that doesn't make it better. That doesn't make you go, oh, goody. He got this whole thing figured out. And so, he's supposed to start off slow. No, you want him to start off fast. And I do also want to say, I had thought that he was going to be a regression candidate this season. Now, I didn't think he was going to drop to something like 800 yards rushing on the season. I thought maybe he'd go from 1,600 to 1,100 to 1,200 yards. A guy who is, more comparable to the running back 8 or 9 on the season, not the running back 3 we saw last year. But I do believe that this is the only time or the last time that you can get him at a discount because of his upcoming schedule. If I'm looking to get Josh Jacobs, I'm looking for guys who have who have done better than, we projected. Rachaad White, if you could get DeAndre Swift for him, that would be pretty crazy. Brian Robinson, who, spoiler, we're going to talk about later. Those are guys I'd be looking to trade to get Josh Jacobs. But his next 9 weeks, he gets Pittsburgh, who's been run all over. The Chargers, who had a historically bad rush defense last year. Green Bay, who just got shredded by the Falcons. New England. Chicago, who was shredded by Green Bay and the Bucks. Detroit. The Giants. The Jets will be tough. And then they get the Dolphins, who gave 234 rushing yards to the Chargers back in week 1. So yes, it does get better. It gets easier for Josh Jacobs. And he has been, has been saving him so far this year. The reason he hasn't had negative points is because of the receiving work. That is something we saw last year. That is something that I think will continue and will continue to give him a floor, even if he does show you -2 rushing yards on a week. So yes, Josh Jacobs, another guy that I would go trade for. My next sell is Raheem Mostert. Mostert has a special place in some people's hearts after what he did for the 49ers a couple years ago in the playoffs. I know a couple of buddies of mine who even, still talk about how they just wish Raheem Mostert always stayed healthy. And I do think that he carries that kind of gravity with him at some points. He is currently the running back 6 with 28 carries, 158 yards, and 3 touchdowns on 73% snap share over the first 2 weeks. And that all sounds pretty great. He's in one of the most dynamic offenses. He is clearly the lead back. He's getting goal line work. He's been efficient. So what is the problem with Raheem Mostert? Raheem Mostert's 31 years old. And he is currently on pace for 240 carries when he has never seen over 181 in a season. And he has only played over 11 games twice. The reason I bring up 31-year-old running backs is since 2010, there have only been 2 running backs over the age of 30 to break 1,000 yards. Those were Frank Gore and Adrian Peterson, 2 greats. So yes, Mostert is playing well now, but it is an extremely long season. For him to break his season high in carries at a point of 240 carries would be unprecedented. To have him continue at this rate would be unprecedented. It's just something that doesn't happen, especially for a guy. And Raheem Mostert is one of the few that I would consider a little more injury prone. I'm not going to say he is injury prone, but he's definitely had more injuries than the average player over his career. So I'm trading Raheem Mostert with the thought of it's going to slow down just because of his age. And I know we don't want to say that age is a factor, but it is. And it needs to be. So I would move on Raheem Mostert for a running back 2 to try and find a guy that I think can last all 17 games or is not going to have another running back continually chipping in to try to spell him throughout the rest of the year. Our last buy low is A.J. Brown, and I know you're sensing a theme here. Players who were elite last year who have been disappointing in the first 2 weeks. And A.J. Brown only had 6 points last week, so he qualifies. And despite this, he still has had 16 targets on 11 receptions. Yeah, the yardage and touchdowns have been lacking, which is, a little unusual compared to what we saw last year, because that was what made him fantasy relevant. He had a great yardage and he had high touchdown production. That was the reason he was the wide receiver 6. But Brown and Hurts were caught jawing on the sideline this last game, and usually when we see the star wide receiver a little unhappy, he gets fed the ball the next week. And I think they're going to try to find a way to give him the ball. I think we also need to remember that Philly lost Shane Steichen this year. This is their first year with a new play caller, and they're reestablishing their offensive identity. And last week against the Vikings, they just didn't have to throw the ball. This is something that good NFL offensive coordinators do. They go, this is working really well. I'm not going to get cute with it. They ran the ball 48 times at almost 5 yards a clip. I wouldn't stop running the ball either. And Brown last year, this is where the optimism comes again for AJ Brown. Last season, only 3 times did he have single-digit points. So this is not something that I think is going to continue. But we're going to see more consistent outcomes coming from A.J. Brown. And the last thing I'll bring up is I have said all offseason that I think Devonta Smith could finish better in fantasy points than A.J. Brown did last year. And while I think that, I still think that A.J. Brown is a top 10 option. I still think that he is a player that you want on your team. And I still think that he is a guy who can win you a week. So just like Jamar Chase, I would be going out and trying to acquire A.J. Brown, and I think you can get him for a lot less than you probably get Jamar Chase for right now. And our final player we're going to talk about is our last sell high, and that is Brian Robinson. And here's the thing with B-Rob. He is not a receiving back who has low efficiency. He has had 4 yards per carry a game only 4 times in his career and has had 9 receptions all of last year. So far, he has 3 receptions with a receiving touchdown and a 30-yard catch, both of which are not going to be consistent things that he's going to do over the year. Also, this Commanders team is not going to score enough touchdowns for him to continue on this rate of almost 24 touchdown pace. He's going to have more and more weeks coming up where he's not going to score these touchdowns. I'm not saying he's Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but this was the reason that last year we said to sell on Clyde Edwards-Helaire because of the touchdown production that he was getting that wasn't necessarily sustainable. And right now, I view Brian Robinson very similarly to Jamal Williams last year, except without the same touchdown upside. Jamal Williams averaged 13 PPR fantasy points a game, and he has 17 touchdowns while doing it. I think you can remove probably 7 of those from Brian Robinson, and that's going to be the year that he's going to have. So, do I think that Brian Robinson will outproduce his draft position of, I want to say, running back 30, 33? Yes, absolutely. But what I would do, similarly with what we've talked about with these other 2 running backs, is I would trade him for a guy like a Joe Mixon, James Conner, or even Josh Jacobs, one of those uglier names who is going to have a similar outcome but has probably a higher ceiling and is going to be way more steady doing it than B-Rob probably will be. I just don't want to play the what-if game. When we play the what-if game, 90% of the time we lose, and if we trade him for a guy like a Joe Mixon, the 10% that we win on, Joe Mixon is going to be similar enough anyways where it's not going to make that big of a difference. So that's what we're looking to accomplish here, is trade him for a guy with similar outcomes who has a much higher hit rate. Well, guys, that wraps it up for our buy low, sell high, our 3 guys of each. I hope that you join me again next week and every week until the trade deadlines hit as we, wade through the waters of, is this guy worth it? Is this guy not? Coming tomorrow, we have the podcast. Lucas will be here Friday with the must starts and sits. And then we do it all again next week with Tie with Waiver Wires podcast, me, another podcast, and then Lucas again. And we will be here every single week. So make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications. But that is it for me. So, deuces.